My name is Marisa Bolivar. I'm a registered dietitian and nutritionist, and I'm so excited to see you guys here this morning. So thank you for joining us as we discuss bone health and prevention of osteoporosis. If you've joined us on a previous class, you may recall that the farm is a deeply meaningful project to me due to the communal connection that it's provided and the nourishment that it's enabled to our North County residents. And we're excited to see it flourish. It's run by Matt Giese, who's sponsored by our church here, Templeton Hills Seventh-day Adventist Church. He does a really great job orchestrating all of the things that are happening at the farm, and we are largely sustained by community volunteers and community donations. And so if you haven't seen it, I invite you to head up there after the class, and if you don't want to fear the winter weather, you could also just take home some produce. We have a whole bunch of produce for you on the back table. Like Leah said, I've covered a different nutrition topic every month, but I really invite your insight because we are here for you and what you are interested in. If there's a topic that's close to your heart or something that you would like to learn more about, please write down your ideas and leave it here with us today so that I have an idea of maybe a different topic that I can cover in the future that would be applicable to you. So, quotes of the month. Reba McEntire once said, "To succeed in life, you only need 3 things: a wishbone, a backbone, and a funny bone." And so while I believe that praying is more productive than wishing, I do agree that ideally we'd have at least 3 bones, hopefully more. That's what distinguishes us from jellyfish. But bones in actuality have so many important jobs. They provide us with mechanical support. They store a lot of our body's minerals, namely calcium and phosphorus. They protect our internal organs. They secrete hormones. They produce blood cells. And so we would hopefully try to optimize them in whatever way we can so that we can ensure their longevity and their health as we advance in age. And then Michael Pollan said in The Omnivore's Dilemma, which is one of my very favorite nutrition books, "A great many of the health and environmental problems created by our food system owe to our attempts to oversimplify nature's complexities at both the growing and the eating ends of our food chain. At either end of the food chain, you find a biological system, patch of soil at one end, human body at the other, and the health of one is connected, literally, to the health of the other." Osteoporosis is suspected to affect about 200 million people worldwide, and it's a major public health problem. And those are just the numbers that we know about. And that's a big deal because the complications of osteoporosis, namely osteoporotic fractures, can be really serious. We suspect that it affects at least 1 in every 4 women over the age of 65. And the prevalence has certainly increased. So in addition to some of the more accepted risk factors, which we'll discuss in our class today, there's also an issue of what we have done as a species that affects climate change, namely over farming and the pollutants that we've used, which have led to mineral depletion in our soil, namely magnesium. And that has its consequence on our dinner table and then ultimately on our bones. So some of you might recall that my background is in oncology nutrition. Osteoporosis is certainly something that I encountered in my private practice. And what's tricky about osteoporosis is we really have no international consensus on the most effective prevention or even the appropriate management and tools to recover bone loss. And so I spent the last 2 months doing a lot of research for you guys. And in addition to scouring PubMed and reading as much material as I could manage and taking a lot of classes from a variety of speakers, I identified themes and I extrapolated those themes to put together hopefully some helpful take-home messages for you so that we have some tools for you all to optimize your bone health. So speaking of that, I mentioned PubMed because I want you all to know that is a great tool for the public. It is the National Institute of Health online library. It's also our world's largest online database for biomedical research and health sciences evidence-based literature. It's really easy to use. Obviously, you know, there's a lot of studies there, over 35 million citations. And so if you'd like some tips on how to identify good, credible literature, I'd be happy to talk to you about that anytime. But it's a great pond to go fishing for evidence. So here's an outline of what we'll be covering today. First, some good eats at the farm, what's ready for harvest up there before you get to try our Mediterranean lentil salad. It's one of my very favorites. I'll go over some definitions and screening diagnostics, some risk factors that we know bring on osteoporosis, as well as some dietary recommendations. I'm going to also serve a Chinese takeout style tofu and broccoli. And then what's the scoop on supplementation and exercise? Busy, I know, busy day. Yeah. So as you may have seen, if not, maybe after class, we have lots of baskets filled over there with beautiful carrots and beets. All the greens are still looking great, which is good timing because greens are good for bones. We have kale and spinach, Swiss chard, arugula, and lettuce mix. The radishes are coming back, and actually as it gets warmer, hopefully soon, they'll heat up a little bit because the warmer the temperatures, the spicier the radishes. And then of course potatoes, and there's potatoes of different colors back there, and our potato yield will be increasing. So this is just kind of the start of the potatoes. They're really delicious. So this is our Mediterranean lentil salad. And Zach, will you cue them so they know to bring it up? This is from one of my very favorite cookbooks. And when I transitioned to a more plant-based diet, I bought like 20 cookbooks because I didn't know where to start, and I'm not very creative. And this has been something that I have gone back to hundreds of times because I mostly cook from cookbooks. It's the Vegan Instapot Cookbook by Nisha Vora. I have gone through 3 Instapots, you guys, and I finally gave up on them. Maybe I should get another one, a different brand, I don't know. But I wore them all out. And so I still use this cookbook all the time, but I just cook from the stove. So don't let that stop you. There's a lot of really creative out-of-the-box ideas and a lot of really wonderful flavors in this cookbook. This dish can be served as a main course or a side dish. So I like that it's just a little unique with the lentils and the greens, the root vegetables, fresh herbs, dried fruit, lots of bone building nutrition, and kind of a fun and flavorful spin on salad. Good bone building material in every bite. My PowerPoint guy is moving and shaking back there. We're gonna be stuck on this for a while. There we go. So in green is the lentils. Like I said, I cooked this over the stove. Leah and her awesome mother-in-law, Zach's mom, made this dish for you guys. So huge thanks to them. That's what they were up to all last night and this morning. And so I would stick to the recipe for the lentils, but the veggies you can mix up however you want. So you could go up there, see what's good and ready for harvest, and focus on that particular vegetable. You don't have to stick to the ones that we listed here today. The dressing is also very nice. So I'm not going to spend too much time on that, but I hope you enjoyed it as much as my family has. Yeah. So bone mineral density is a lot like it sounds. It quite literally translates to the mineral the amount of mineral that's in your bone tissue. And most of that is calcium and phosphorus. If you've ever watched an apartment or an office building under construction, you may have noticed the metal scaffolding that holds it upright. And I would equate that to our bones, right? That's what our bones do for our body. They keep us upright. One of the most incredible things about bone tissue is that it is a live, living organ, which means that it is constantly broken down and replaced. So your skeleton today is a different skeleton than you had yesterday. I find that pretty remarkable, hopefully for the better. And there's two primary cellular drivers for that, the osteoblasts and the osteoclasts. Osteoblasts create new bone tissue. They lay down your skeleton. They collect material, and then they add either growth to existing bone, or they're literally building new healthy bone. Osteoclasts also have an important job, even though they sound like the bad guys. They dissolve bone. So they are responsible for taking old and damaged bone, tearing it down, resorbing it, and making room for newer, healthier cells. So they work together to build your skeleton and keep it healthy and with good integrity. So as you're aging, like from a young child, your osteoblasts are probably more productive than the osteoclasts, right? Because they're adding to a growing skeleton. But when we reach our 20s, that process starts to slow down. And then around age 30, we're thought to reach our peak bone mass. So after that, osteoblasts have a harder time keeping up with the osteoclasts, and we start losing bone mass. And if that process continues, we develop what's called osteopenia, which literally translates to poor bone mineral density. And that's when those osteoclasts aren't doing as good of a job, or osteoblasts aren't doing as good of a job as keeping up with the osteoclasts. Now, if that process continues to progress, it leads us to an eventual osteoporosis, which means porous bone. And that's characterized by excessive bone loss, reduced bone formation, or often a combination of those two. And you can see those images there. The osteoporotic bone on the right would be a lot easier to break than the one on the left, right? Because it's a lot more fragile. So for most people, osteoporosis is painless. They have no idea they have it, but it may surface as some chronic back pain caused by, some small vertebral fractures. It could be a stooped posture, but for most people, it's not a problem unless they get a break, and that's usually caused by a fall, right? You fall down, you have an osteoporotic fracture, and then you learn maybe that you have osteoporosis. And that's a big deal because especially as we age, it's a lot harder to bounce back from an osteoporotic fracture. In fact, there's a number of studies that shows that 20% of women and even 40% of men pass away within the first year of having an osteoporotic fracture in older age. So one point I do want to drive home is that just because you have poor bone mineral density doesn't mean you're going to fracture, right? There's plenty of people that have lifelong poor bone mineral density and they never experience an osteoporotic fracture. So they're not necessarily the same thing. So the image in the background was of a DEXA, but it's kind of hard to see. Provided you've never had a fall that resulted in a fracture, how do you know you have osteoporosis? Well, the most common and accurate way to do this uses a dual energy X-ray absorptometry. We abbreviate that as DEXA, and it's a scan that can tell you how dense your bones are. There's two main types. A central DEXA goes over your lower spine and your hips. That's probably a better predictor for how high your risk is of breaking a hip. And a peripheral DEXA is a much smaller machine, not quite as accurate, but it maybe is something that you've seen at a health fair or at a pharmacy, and it can look at the density of your fingers and your wrist, your heel, maybe your lower leg. And these scans are mostly recommended for women over 65 because we know that once you're over 65, you have a much higher risk, right? But it could also be for somebody that has an outstanding risk factor, or not just diagnosing osteoporosis, but also determining if a medication actually did its job and is helping you improve your bone mineral density. So the results of your test are reported as a T-score and sometimes a Z-score. You won't always see a Z-score on your results. A T-score compares your bone mineral density to that of a healthy 30-year-old white woman. So if you look around this room, there's not a lot of people that are healthy 30-year-old white women, and they chose that population because Caucasian women are the very highest risk for osteoporosis, and 30 is when we're expected to have our peak bone mass. So they're taking the highest risk person at the best possible point in time, and that's why they use T-score. And Z-score, comparatively, looks at your bone mineral density to somebody of your gender, your age, and your ethnicity. Now, that might seem like a more fair comparison, but really what they're looking for is the magnitude of change, right, from optimal to where you are now. And so Z-score could be comparing someone that's kind of unhealthy to you, which isn't quite as helpful of a score. Risk factors are things that we know put us at a greater risk for a disease or a condition. So known risk factors that you can control, because we can't control all of them, right? But for osteoporosis, chiefly is diet. Inadequate calcium and vitamin D over a long period of time especially doesn't give your bones enough material to lay down your skeleton. So that's our single biggest factor with osteoporosis. Secondly, insufficient physical activity, because like muscles, bones become stronger with exercise. Low body weight is a major predictor for osteoporosis, and we'll talk about that more in a minute. But even higher risk would be somebody that had a gastric bypass surgery and lost weight that way, or maybe someone that has struggled with an eating disorder. Smoking and alcohol use can impair calcium absorption, calcium utilization, and retention. So those are also chief risk factors, as well as a host of medications, especially steroids and anti-seizure medications, chemotherapeutic agents, antidepressants, and aromatase inhibitors. Probably the most common medication, which is mostly over the counter, are medications that are used for acid reflux. So that would be like omeprazole, we call that proton pump inhibitors, Prilosec, Nexium, or it could be an H2 blocker like Pepcid AC, and that's just because your absorption of calcium is going to go down quite a bit when you're on that medication. So I guess one of the considerations, just kind of a spectrum here, is can you conservatively manage your condition without relying on that medication? I know that if I have more than 1 cup of coffee in the morning, I have acid reflux, kind of miserable. I have to use a H2 blocker like Pepcid AC. So I make sure that I limit myself to 1 cup of coffee, right? And there's all kinds of things that trigger acid reflux. But if your doctor prescribed you aromatase inhibitors for the hormone-sensitive breast cancer that you had, and we know that really helps to prevent a recurrence of hormone-sensitive breast cancer, then that doesn't mean that you give up. You need to be on that medication. It means that you double down. Now you have to work even harder to keep your bones healthy. It's not an excuse to resign, right? It's an excuse, it's a reason to work even harder to do that.
Would that be something like tamoxifen?
Tamoxifen, yes, it does affect your bone health, but tamoxifen blocks estrogen further, or estrogen production further down the chain of estrogen production, and so it would have less of an impact on your bone health. Aromatase inhibitors blocks production from the very beginning, so it would have a bigger impact on your bone health. So risk factors that you can't control: older age, bone breakdown picks up speed as we age. Your likelihood of developing osteoporosis is higher if you are a female, because we just have a smaller skeleton than men do. You're also at a greater risk if you are Caucasian or Asian ethnicity. Doesn't mean that other ethnicities don't struggle with it, just a higher prevalence. If you have someone close in your family, like a mom or a sister, an aunt, a sibling that has struggled with osteoporosis, you are also at greater risk for having the same condition. Hormonal changes, I mentioned estrogen just now, but estrogen is extremely protective for our bone health. Same with treatment for prostate cancer would put you at greater risk, or if you have too much thyroid, so either overactive thyroid or you have hypothyroid and you're overcompensating by taking too much thyroid, that would also accelerate your bone loss. So, and then lastly, any medical conditions, celiac disease, inflammatory bowel disease, kidney or liver disease, epilepsy, rheumatoid arthritis, those would all put you at much greater risk, which again means that you just have to double down. And I wrote there, although effective management may be in your control, because that also affects your risk. If you manage your condition really beautifully and you're compliant, you do what you can to manage it without medications, then your risk certainly would decrease. So going back to areas within our control, how much do we need? This table outlines recommended dietary calcium and vitamin D intakes broken up by the life stage and therefore our expected skeletal need. If you don't see yourself represented on this table, come talk to me after class and I'll tell you what your number is. I didn't include everybody. But you'll see a parentheses after the calcium intakes there. And it looks like it got cut off in one place. But anyway, on the parentheses recommend recommendations or suggest recommendations from other governments. So namely United Kingdom, United States, and Australia, because those are all developed countries. So they have a lot of research backing their recommendations too. What's interesting about it is the US recommendation is notably higher for calcium than every other country. So that's your first question. Why is that different? And then secondly, there's no international consensus. And so anytime we see a huge variation in the recommendations, especially for a nutrient that's as important as calcium, just tells you that no one has really figured it out completely. So we still have a lot of research to do. And a lot of these numbers were come up with in the 1990s, so it has been a while before they've changed. But unfortunately, to change your recommendation as the government, anyway, for what you think meets the population's needs, you need a boatload of research, decades and decades of evidence-based trials to show and justify that there should be a change in those recommendations. If you remember me mentioning this previously, I did my master's thesis on vitamin D, and the USDA gave me a hefty grant to cover all of my research. And I studied women in a human subjects trial. I supplemented them with vitamin D. They were all perimenopausal women, and they were all deficient. And I was funded by the USDA to determine a more appropriate daily allowance for vitamin D, because we know, the government knows, they'll be first to admit that 600 IUs a day is likely grossly insufficient. And it is. But this was 15 years ago, and our recommendations still have not changed. And there are hundreds and hundreds of other trials that are still going on in order to budge that number and make it higher. So we can guess what it is, and I'll tell you. It's probably closer to 1,000, maybe 2,000 IUs a day, but they just have to have so much justification before they change those recommendations. It takes a long time.
Current D comes in 2,000 IUs.
Some of them do. Yeah, it's interesting. It's actually harder to find a vitamin D supplement that has 600 IUs, which is our recommended daily allowance. And that is thought to meet 97% of the healthy population's needs, which it doesn't, but it's kind of funny that like you can't even find a supplement that is the RDA. A lot of supplements are like pretty concentrated though. So
What's the difference between vitamin D2 and D3?
Vitamin D2 is from plant-based sources, so namely mushrooms. It's not as bioavailable, so it would be my recommendation that a D3 is superior. D3 is principally from the sun, but it's also from animal-based sources. And it's not like vitamin D is infused into your skin from the sun, kind of counterintuitive. The sun just triggers a hormone in your skin that becomes activated by your kidney and then your liver to create vitamin D. It's more of a steroidal hormone than it is a vitamin. It just happened to be discovered in food. So that's why we call it a vitamin. Yeah.
Question.
Yeah.
You said you recommend 1 to 2 supplements.
I'm going to go there later in the presentation. Yeah, I'll give you hopefully a good recommendation. So in order to answer how much calcium is really appropriate for you, I'm going to first show you 3 women, and all of these women, as you can see, are Caucasian. They're in the same age group and roughly the same risk factors. So the first on the left is Carrie Walsh Jennings. She's a 3-time Olympic gold medalist in beach volleyball, quite an athlete. She's 44 years old now, and she stands tall at 6 foot 3 inches. And then the middle is yours truly, your friendly neighborhood dietitian. And I'm 5'7", so more of an average height, and I'm 37 years old, but certainly not a world-class athlete like Carrie. And then the last on the right is Judy Garland. And that's because I had a hard time finding a petite, famous person that you would all know, who is 4'11". So definitely more of a petite frame. She's pictured here in 1959 when she was roughly 37 years old. And she was not known for her athleticism. She was known for her acting and her singing. So the reason I'm going with that is because we have very different skeletons, right? And let's say on an average day, Carrie Walsh Jennings averaged just over 1,000 milligrams a day. I was somewhere around 700, and Judy was 450. Well, if our USDA recommendation is 1,000 milligrams a day for calcium, my question to you is who got enough of the 3 of us? Maybe. But I would argue that she was technically sufficient. Carrie met the mark there. Her skeleton is significantly bigger, and she is significantly active with a high impact sport. She has a lot of bone turnover every day, right, with all of her training and her performance. And so 700 is just over what we call the estimated average requirement. I'm a little bit shorter, and that was probably actually perfect for me. That's probably all my skeleton needs. And then Judy is acting and singing. She's not athletic. She doesn't have as much bone turnover, and she's 4'11". Her skeleton need is significantly less. So she was actually probably very appropriate there. So of the 3 of us, the only person that was likely inadequate was Carrie. She probably needed more than that. And what this boils down to is that your calcium need probably depends on your skeletal need, right? How big and active is your skeleton? So the research is ever changing, but some take-home considerations to remember here is firstly, calcium requirement for men and women is lower than previously estimated because overall calcium balance is highly regulated and highly resistant to change. That means that your body does a really good job trying to figure it out. And it will absorb more calcium if it needs more calcium. And obviously this process isn't perfect, right? But overall, we know that your body will adjust as much as possible. Secondly, calcium intake does not require close scrutiny for the majority. Most of us who eat healthfully meet our physiologic needs without actually trying. And then lastly, more calcium intake does not improve bone mineral density or decrease fracture risk, because there's likely a plateau effect. And that plateau effect across all bodies of literature seems to be around 500 milligrams a day. So if you are taking in more than 500 milligrams a day, which is our estimated average requirement, that was thought to meet 50% of the population's needs, but it's actually probably a lot greater than that, then you probably won't be absorbing it. So that is the first set of take-home considerations. I'd be happy to supply anybody with some citations too if you would like more information about that. So what about milk then? I think the Got Milk campaign is something that all of us are pretty familiar with. Milk mustache, glass of milk, right? And I think the reality of it is most of us have been told that if we have enough milk and enough dairy products in our diet, we're adequate, right? We're protected from osteoporosis. We're getting all the calcium that we need. In fact, I think most people have a hard time coming up with concentrated calcium sources that are not milk or dairy products. Like you really have to think about it. What else other than milk has calcium in it? And I think that collectively it's easier to resign into the opinion of those that we respect. Just tell me what to do. And namely, those people that we respect can be a doctor, it can be an educated friend. I'm going to make a little detour on this topic just to make a point. 5 years ago, I was studying for my baptism, and I had a lot of really big questions. And I would bring these questions to Pastor Zach, and I would ask him all these questions. He would always refer to scripture. And this was a profound experience for me, because after 8 months of this, I was like, Zach, just tell me what to think. Like, just tell me what you think. Boil it down for me. Give me your opinion. I trust you. And he said, Marisa, my opinion doesn't matter. It matters what the scripture says. You have to go to the right source for information. It doesn't matter what I say. And obviously, our research body of evidence is not divine inspired. And PubMed is not the Bible. But the reason I tell you this is because I think it's easier to answer those questions with those that you respect, and some of this information that you hear might be conflicting to something that your doctor told you, or maybe a trusted friend told you. And I think that the best advice I can give you is to go back to the evidence-based literature or another credible source and make the decisions for yourself. So speaking of that, this is the research on dairy. These were some of the best studies I could find because they were really large. They had 20 to 400,000 people in them. Some of these participants were followed for over 20 years to see what the long-term impact was of dairy consumption. And some of these reviews had more than 18 studies in them. So it's good information, it's credible, it's things that you can rely on. And if you don't want to take these citations home with you and looking them up on your own computer, which is why I included them, because you'll have access to my slides after the presentation. I am going to summarize them for you. Firstly, a greater intake of milk and dairy products does not lower the risk of osteoporosis and hip fracture. In fact, every additional cup of daily milk is associated with a 9% greater risk of hip fracture. I found that to be very stunning, actually. These findings, I think, partially explain a long-standing enigma that osteoporosis and the incidence of hip fracture is greatest in the countries that consume the most dairy products. So some of this research helps explain that. Yogurt, however, is the exception. Modest intakes may help lower the risk of hip fracture. And so clearly there's something special about yogurt, which we'll get to in just a second. But there's also a consideration that maybe healthier people eat yogurt more regularly. So it may not boil down to what the research always says, right? The more milk people drink, the higher the risk of total mortality, death by heart disease, and death by cancer. For every additional glass of milk each day, increased mortality was observed, especially with whole milk consumption. So there's a lot of reasons that could be the case. Researchers have pointed their finger at the saturated fat in milk. Well, that must be really bad. That's probably why, it has such a big impact. We also know that the protein in milk is suboptimal. Anything that's more concentrated in branched chain amino acids has some long-term health considerations. But the primary culprit here was something really surprising. It had nothing to do with the fat. It had nothing to do with the protein. It was the sugar. It was D-galactose. D-galactose is a monosaccharide. It's a simple sugar, and it comprises milk. Well, what's curious about yogurt is there's so many good, helpful little bugs in yogurt. They love D-galactose. They eat it up for you, and then there's none left for your body, or at least maybe a minimal amount. And so yogurt is unique in that way. But D-galactose has been associated with a lot of really negative variables. We're finding that chronic exposure to D-galactose promotes cellular aging through oxidative stress. It can trigger neurodegenerative diseases. It can compromise your immune health, and it can even trigger a host of genetic mutations. So we're finding that this is probably our primary culprit to dairy products. So could the dairy industry be lying to us? Maybe. But I think for me anyway, as a consumer, what's more concerning about it is the foundations and the organizations that have backed the Got Milk campaign, like the U.S. National Osteoporosis Foundation. And we're finding that they have accepted a pretty tremendous amount of money from the dairy industry, and they are likely swayed when it comes to promoting certain ideas, so may not be as reliable as we once thought. And that information is available on their website in case you want to look it up. So with all of this negative data on milk, we have a pretty good idea that non-dairy vitamin D and calcium fortified beverages might be a good alternative. But what about a plant-based diet? There's an abundant body of evidence that suggests that vegetarians and vegans are actually the highest risk dietary group for osteoporosis, which is so curious because we also have another abundant body of research that says the more fruits and vegetables and the more fiber you have, the lower your incidence of fracture. So those are pretty conflicting, right? And I think the most obvious answer is, well, if you are vegetarian, especially vegan, maybe you're not getting enough of something important. And that's exactly what it is. If you are vegetarian, especially vegan, you may not be as intentional about your calcium intake and especially your vitamin D intake. And so if you fall into that group, you want to make sure that you are definitely hitting the mark at 500 milligrams of calcium a day and that you know what your vitamin D status is. But luckily, that was not the primary risk factor. The primary risk factor for this group of people was body weight. Because vegetarians and especially vegans tend to be lower in weight. And we know that body weight is the single biggest risk factor or variable that determines fracture risk. So if you were here for cancer nutrition last time, you may recall that body fat is not idle. It doesn't just sit there and hang out. It secretes estrogen, and estrogen is really protective for our bone health. So that is probably the biggest factor right there. But having some extra cushion when you fall is certainly helpful too. And it provides a 24/7 weight-bearing exercise for you, because if your skeleton has to carry extra mass, then it will strengthen it and it will reinforce it. Lastly, if you have a smaller body frame, there's less mass to draw on as we age, because you may recall that it stores minerals, right? Yeah.
What point does obesity enter in on the other end of the spectrum?
I know. See, what's so funny about this is to be a lean, mean, veggie eating machine protects you from everything except for that. And so you have to like compromise, right? But I would say that it's better to be attentive and aware of how much you are getting for calcium and vitamin D. Make sure that you have adequacy and prevent your risk of everything else by being leaner. Does that answer your question?
Yes.
So lots of things we can do to optimize ourselves, including our bone health, principally eating a nutritious diet. And in addition to the calcium-containing foods that I put on the back table, I listed some foods here for you that I think are uniquely helpful for bones. So several key nutrients that have been consistently identified are fiber, potassium, magnesium, beta-carotene, and vitamin C. And so a lot of this list is made up of a combination of those. And if you're wondering if that translates to a lower risk of hip fractures, it absolutely does. So consistently, so beautifully. One of the main reasons for that is the osteoclasts that break down bone use sort of a chisel. They have a tool set to do that. And one of the primary chisels it uses are oxidants. And oxidants, like free radicals, are everywhere, right? They're in our diet, they're in our environment, and the best way to counter it is with antioxidants in our food, which come from fresh fruits and vegetables and whole grains and nuts and seeds. And so that is one of the primary reasons that you'll see this list here have lots of antioxidant value. So firstly, low oxalate leafy greens packed with calcium. Oxalates are a natural byproduct, the waste product of fruits and vegetables. And they're not bad for you, but they do bind calcium. They're like best friends with calcium. And so spinach, beet greens, and chard, because they're high in oxalates, won't make the calcium as available to you. Spinach is probably the most high. Does it mean spinach is bad for you? No, spinach is wonderful for you. But if you're eating spinach to help your bones, it's probably not as productive. Better to choose a low oxalate option like a cruciferous green, maybe broccoli or kale. Fortified beverages have all the glory of the nutrient density without D-galactose. So it's like the perfect combination. And most plant-based milks are fortified with calcium these days. So I chose the 2 oat milks that are in our refrigerator at home because it's a good example. This oat milk is fortified. It has 110 milligrams of calcium per 1 cup serving, which is a pretty good amount. This one is also fortified. This one has 470 milligrams for a 1 cup serving. Wow, big difference there. So I would look at the label and choose something that's pretty concentrated. If you are adding it to your coffee, you probably won't absorb it though. Coffee, unfortunately, counteracts the absorption. But this one does taste good in coffee, in case you're wondering. So the only downside is calcium in these beverages tend to settle to the bottom, and that means you have to shake it, or you won't get it until that very last cup, which is going to be a lot of calcium. So better to shake it and evenly distribute it into every serving. But that's a wonderful, very bioavailable source of calcium for you. Yeah, they can be. Yeah, but well, the percentages apply to a 70 kilogram healthy male. This one has 7 grams for 1 cup serving, which actually isn't bad. Yeah, but you will find some that are sweetened and certainly have a lot. Yeah, almond milk is great. Yeah, it's a really good option too. Yep. Yeah, it tends to be a little bit lower in calories. So, calcium set tofu has extra calcium in it, but organic soy products like tofu and ground flaxseed are also very concentrated in phytoestrogens. And the beauty of estrogens is that it has protective estrogenic effects on your bones without any downsides. So that's a great tool for you to have in your refrigerator. Tahini and sesame seeds are just a fun, surprising source of calcium. Green tea packed with antioxidants. So again, helps prevent that chisel that we use to dissolve old bone. Almonds actually inhibit osteoclast activity and even their formation. Certain whole grains, legumes, nuts, and seeds have lots of phytates. And actually, it's funny because phytates got a bad rap for a long time. And the idea was that, well, if you have phytates in your diet, you're not absorbing any calcium. But they're finding that phytates are really helpful to boost osteoblasts and inhibit osteoclasts. So now one of the dietary risk factors for osteoporosis is a low phytate diet. Ooh, you're not getting enough whole grains, legumes, nuts, and seeds in your diet. You are inherently a higher risk for osteoporosis. So the research has really changed about that. Dried fruit, I wrote prunes there because it's the most studied, but they have lots of antioxidants. Fresh fruits and vegetables, especially onions, again, loaded in antioxidants, very helpful in a totally different way for your bones. But some of these foods are also very fibrous. And one interesting thing about that, you may remember me telling you that fiber was great for our bones, is that when fiber is digested in your gut, you have all these little bugs in your gut, right? They break down fiber and they create something new. And one of those new things is short-chain fatty acids. And short-chain fatty acids have lots of good benefits for your health. But one of their most impactful things that they do for our bones is that they expedite and boost calcium absorption. Calcium is absorbed from our large intestine. So in the presence of short-chain fatty acids, we get double, if not more, calcium absorption from our food. So the two are a great symbiotic team. And then lastly, or almost lastly other than yogurt, which you already know about, wild-caught freshwater fish, and I'm talking about from the backcountry of Alaska, where there's minimal contaminants in the water. If you have a really cool friend that goes to Alaska and sends you fish, that's a great source of vitamin D. So this is our Chinese takeout style tofu and broccoli from the same cookbook. One of my favorites. Yeah. That's such a good question. Non-dairy yogurt tends to be less often fortified. Yeah. So I think that's starting to change. But that would eliminate, certainly a host of risk factors. But since the D-galactose is one of the main variables there, it's not really as much of a consideration for dairy-containing yogurt. I just hope that it becomes more fortified and can serve as the same benefit.
It says low fat. How about the whole milk yogurt?
So there would be just as much calcium in that, but whole milk yogurt comes at the cost of saturated fat, which most people are trying to escape. So on the other end of the spectrum, you could go for a non-fat yogurt. However, vitamin D is fat soluble, and you'll absorb less vitamin D in the presence of no fat. Tricky, right? So probably if you're going to have yogurt, the best bet is a 1 or 2% milk fat yogurt, because you would absorb all of the vitamin D without the cost of having a bunch of saturated fat. The calcium's the same. Yeah.
Would you have an opinion on something like Prolia?
Is that a medication? Yeah. So actually, I'm glad that you brought up, we had a question about medication, and I'm glad that you brought that up, because I purposely omitted medications from my discussion today. And I thought long and hard about that, but my goal is to equip you with nutrition and lifestyle tools, not with medication information. So I want to encourage you to talk to your doctor and find a good option for that. And yeah. Yeah, lactose-free milk usually has lactate or lactase added to it, which is just the enzyme to help you digest the lactose. And lactose is different from D-galactose. Lactose is a disaccharide and D-galactose is a monosaccharide, so it's a different type of sugar. And lactose is not bad for you. It's just some people can't digest it. And so if they add the enzyme to it, it'll just help you digest it so you're not miserable, hopefully. Same calcium. Yeah, it's just like how much is the sugar present for your gut to digest.
What about the casein? Because there's A2 milk, dairy milk produces casein milk.
Mm-hmm.
How does casein, or does it?
I didn't find any consistent research on the effect of whey or casein in milk and its impact on bones. It seemed like the primary variable that came up consistently was degalactose. Yeah. So as for stir fry, I feel like it offers you so much room for creativity because you don't have to use broccoli. You could go up to the farm and see whatever's looking good up there and ready to harvest, and you could do all greens. You could do carrots. You could do cauliflower instead of broccoli. You could do a host of vegetables and just throw it all together because I think the real secret in a good stir fry is the sauce. And that's why I love this recipe. It's one of our favorite sauces. I've added it to all kinds of things. And that's going to be our focus today. But as for tofu, for all of the tofu skeptics in the audience, there's a few keys, I think, to helping it taste good or better. The first is selecting the right variety because tofu comes in a lot of different forms. And if you opt for a super firm or extra firm variety of tofu, then it inherently has a denser texture and less water activity in it. I'll show you how to prep that in a second. So if you're using a soft or silken tofu, you'll almost always want to press the water out of it because once you cook it, it will help hold its shape, right? Otherwise, it's just going to fall apart on you. And the other thing to consider is that if there's so much water in there, it doesn't take on the flavor that you're giving it because as too much water, there's just not enough space. So you kind of have to get the excess water out. And then finally, don't be stingy with the seasonings. You got to load that puppy up because tofu is a totally blank canvas. And so if you're adding aromatics and sauces and spices, it'll take on all of that flavor in place of water. Yeah.
Is there a difference or more of an advantage to buying sprouted tofu?
That's a really good question. I'd have to look that up.
That's what I buy, sprouted.
Yeah, I'll have to look that up. Thank you. So the first ingredients in green are your tofu that you're going to marinate. Here's your nice spongy block of tofu. And the way that you do this is by cutting it into slabs. And in a perfect world, you would have 30 minutes to squeeze out the extra tofu. So you could put a tea towel down or some paper towels. And my iron skillet's being used back there, but it was meant to show you that I put an iron skillet on top of it in between the towels, and then I load it up with cans. It's really heavy. And then about 15 minutes, I check it, and if these towels are really wet, I swap them out for dry towels. And that eliminates all of the excess water. So in a perfect world, you'd wait 30 minutes. Now, if you're on the go, stir fries are quick. It's Monday night, you have to put dinner on the table. You could also opt for a pre-marinated version. This is an extra firm tofu. It is very dense, so it cooks beautifully when it's pan fried. I used a little bit of sesame seed oil today. It has all that flavor that's been sitting in there for a while. And this is an organic tofu. I think it's a great substitute if you don't want to spend the time to marinate this, because after you squeeze out that tofu, you'd have to put it in a bag with the flavors and have it hang out for at least 5 minutes. I think that the pre-marinated version is actually more flavorful, but if you let it sit in the marinade longer, it'll be really flavorful too. And then the sauce is in purple. I doubled it for this recipe because we like a lot of sauce in our house. What can I say? Especially if you put it over a grain. And today we served it with quinoa. But if you are cooking for less people or you feel like that's an overkill, you can chop it in half. And then finally, the yellow is your vegetables because it's whatever your heart desires. I just felt like broccoli was particularly appropriate for today because we know it has so much good antioxidants and lots of calcium available to you. Any questions about the recipe? All right, so can be pretty hard to meet your dietary needs with diet alone, right, for calcium. So that brings up an important topic, which is calcium supplementation. And anytime you consider supplementing with something, I want you to ask yourself 2 questions. Is it effective and is it safe? So on the topic of calcium, does calcium supplements do anything? Is it helpful for me? And does it have any other health consequences? In order to answer this question, I did a pretty thorough review of literature, and I did notice some small benefit. And the biggest benefit actually was for teen girls, adolescent girls, who started supplementing during their teenage years, and they did notice some improvements, modest improvements, in their 20s and even younger 30s for their bone mineral density. However, after about 7 years, if they stopped supplementing, that benefit, gone. It was like it never even existed. And so what's hard about that is it's not a very helpful take home for the general population, right? I didn't supplement. That's not helpful for me. And so we're looking at a bigger picture here. And what we did notice was that there were some meaningful associations with calcium supplementation in the literature. Women taking all kinds of doses of calcium supplements had absolutely no fracture prevention in their older years. They did have a much, much higher risk of cardiovascular health problems. So the increased risk was consistent across all trials, whether those events were fully adjudicated or from hospital discharge summaries, death summaries, or self-report. So why does calcium from supplements differ so much than dietary calcium on our vascular health? I think that's the biggest question. Well, as soon as you swallow a calcium supplement, your blood level spikes up and it rises steadily high for pretty long time, maybe 8 hours or even longer, depending on the person and how quickly they metabolize that calcium. And that impact, that spike in blood calcium triggers what's called a hypercoagulatory state, which contributes to clotting. But it also can affect carotid artery plaque thickness, arterial calcification, your risk of heart attack, and then, of course, consequently, death. So that's a very notable finding. That's pretty different from I know, right? That's pretty different from dietary source of calcium, which just like other foods, you eat it, your body has to break it down and digest it and then slowly absorb it over a period of time. So that doesn't negate the fact that calcium supplements have been very widely embraced, right? Your doctor may have told you, for instance, to take a calcium supplement. And I think that was on the grounds that supplementation seems like a natural and therefore safe way to get calcium. But we're finding that it is not natural to have 1 or 2 daily boluses that spike our blood calcium levels because food doesn't do that. In fact, it doesn't produce any of the same metabolic effects. And the evidence is steadily increasing that it is not safe. And that's probably why all of the organizations have changed their tune on calcium supplementation and now advise that if you need calcium, it should be from your diet, not from supplements. In fact, I think John Hopkins said it best, the best calcium supplement is none. And that's on their website. And here are a list of some of my citations. It was all I could fit without it being like size 5 font. Need a microscope. So if you'd like additional information or you want to look up any of these studies, I encourage you to do so. Yeah.
Is there any evidence regarding risk of plant-based
calcium? Same risk. Yeah, I purposely included that because I wanted to eliminate that as a contributing variable, and the risk was exactly the same. Yeah. So I'm happy to report that there is a very significant consensus on the safety of vitamin D supplementation. It's encouraged because it is really hard to get enough vitamin D from your diet without supplementation, and vitamin D is calcium's best friend. In fact, if you're deficient in vitamin D, you just don't absorb calcium. At best, you might absorb 20% of your dietary intake, so it's really important that your blood vitamin D levels are healthy and sufficient. And so my first advice to you is get your blood tested. It's a really simple test to see where you are, because if you are deficient, we should be correcting it with supplementation. But I want you to know how much supplementation. Don't just throw 4,000 IUs at an unknown, right? It's important to know what it is that you're correcting. If you get your blood tested, you're not taking supplements, and you're in the healthy range, congratulations. You don't need any vitamin D supplements. Or if you get your blood tested and you're super high, you got to back off, because vitamin D toxicity is actually a real problem. It's probably even more serious than deficiency, and we certainly don't want to be adding gasoline to that problem. So first determine where you are, and if you are correcting an issue, it might be appropriate for you to get a repeat on that blood test every 6 to 12 months and be able to correct that issue.
Is that a usual thing that's on a usual blood panel, or is that
Now
something
it
you have
is.
to ask for?
Sometimes you still have to ask.
Yes. But I would say that it's becoming more of a routine pathology. And you can always group it in with something. I don't think there's an urgency, but if you happen to get blood work for something else, you can ask them to tag it on. Just for curious, yeah.
How much vitamin D do you get from the sun?
It depends, actually. And I attempted to solve that question by testing my participants. I had 100 women in my study, and I put little solar tags on them on their wrists, paid them extra to wear that. And it was pretty remarkable because, you know, first of all, it depends on how much exposure you have. If you work indoors, you're mostly indoors, then obviously it's going to be a lot less, right? But if you're active, you work outdoors, you garden or have outdoor activities, then it would be substantially more. But then the next question is, how much sunscreen do you wear? Because that also blocks the synthesis of vitamin D. How much clothing cover do you have? Do you wear a hat? All of those things would dramatically affect even the cloud coverage. Like right now, your vitamin D synthesis would be substantially less than on a blue sky sunny day. And then there's a question of skin health, right? And our risk for skin cancer. And so I don't know, I would wager I'm at particularly high risk for skin cancer. It's in my family. And so I would probably opt for sunscreen and take a vitamin D supplement. But on a good sunny day with no cloud coverage and no sunscreen or limited sunscreen and t-shirt and shorts or bathing suit or whatever, you could absorb a whole week or month's worth of vitamin D. Yeah, you could get easily probably, I don't know, 75,000. I mean, it's a substantial amount. And your liver actually can do a pretty good job storing it. So it doesn't mean like you should rely on that, but a good sunny day, don't go home and take your supplement. You got all the vitamin D that you needed. Does that answer your question?
So the supplement doesn't have to be taken daily? It's taken based on your sun?
You could. I mean, I play with that, but I know way more than I want to know about vitamin D. I couldn't wait to finish my master's thesis, like never talk about vitamin D again, and here I am. But you know, it's probably good to be consistent, and for most people, they're in a routine of doing things, and if you do something every day, you're probably more likely to keep doing it. So, yeah.
You mentioned phosphorus and magnesium early in the presentation. They
Yeah.
kind of disappeared.
They did disappear because they didn't get the hot seat today. Calcium did, but they're just friends, right? They're friends of calcium. So they all work together to contribute to the material that your bone uses to lay down its skeleton. And inherently, you tend to be adequate in that. in a healthy, well-rounded diet. Whether it was plant-based or omnivore or meat eater, you tend to be pretty adequate in those minerals. I'm sorry?
More like a trace.
Yeah, so there is a question of mineral depletion, and the main mineral of concern was magnesium in soil health that I brought up in the quote. And because they all work in compilation, that's certainly a factor for concern. But I think that you can also compensate for that with a well-rounded diet. It just might help to explain the prevalence of osteoporosis.
I just wonder about back to the calcium supplement. I have one that is algae based, and it's you're supposed to take 3 in one time. And I'm wondering if you take one and then space it, take the other one, and not giving yourself a bolus all at once, and you're just taking at lower levels throughout the day.
Yeah.
At least till I use up the bottle.
Yeah, and I guess it depends on how big that bolus is. It should definitely not be more than 500 milligrams. But there was still that cardiovascular risk noticed at 500 milligrams of calcium. Now, if your bolus is 200, I would say that's a safer bet and probably a better supplement. And you must be a very diligent consumer because it's hard to remember to take calcium 3 times a day. And there's also things that interfere with how much of it is absorbed. So if you have like a cup of tea or coffee in the morning, then your calcium is going to be compromised by that.
Your body stores calcium?
In the skeleton, yes.
So that sun exposure on a nice day, is that like 4 hours outside?
With vitamin D, it is, I would say a healthy daily dose would be 15 minutes of sun exposure for most people. Now you become less effective at synthesizing it as you age. Your skin is just not as productive in that way. So for somebody through age, I don't know, I'm going to throw out a somewhat arbitrary number of 70. If you went outside during lunch and had your sandwich sitting in the sun for 15 minutes, you probably would get a pretty good dose of vitamin D. So if you're not as receptive to supplementing, that might be a good substitute, but your blood will not lie to you. So if that's how you normally get your vitamin D intake and you get a blood test and you're in the healthy range, it's working great. Yeah, might be a good substitute. So best medicine other than diet is exercise. And like muscles, bones become stronger with activity. And that's because exercise transmits forces through your skeleton that triggers bone turnover. It kind of wakes up your osteoblasts and kicks them into gear with any force that you might endure. So you want to aim for about 30 minutes of exercise a day. It does not need to be high impact, but it should be challenging because you're looking for tug and force on your bones. In fact, we measure that with something called strain magnitude, strain rate, and strain frequency, which means how much force and how much tug and tension are you applying to your bones while you're active, because that's what's waking up those osteoblasts to lay down your skeleton. So examples might be jogging or running, hiking or stair climbing, aerobics, dancing, jumping rope, volleyball, tennis, soccer, or my new personal favorite, walking with a weighted vest. And some people might mistake this as a bulletproof vest. No one's gonna mess with you when you're walking the dog. I bet you can guess what my mom got for Mother's Day this year. Sadly for her. So this is a weighted vest, and there's all kinds of options online because they are finding that walking, just regular walking, and I mean without hills or added weight, unfortunately does not prevent bone loss. So it's not nearly as productive as once we thought. This is 10 pounds. If you'd like to feel it after the class, you can see what that feels like. It's like heavier than you would expect, but it kind of evenly distributes the weight. So there is a downside, which is if you have osteoporosis in your spine or any history of back injury, it might be hard on your back. So I would think about that. And if you wanted to try it, maybe take some weight off and start with 2 pounds or something like that. But it's that extra added weight on your skeleton that helps with the bone turnover. Cycling and swimming, for the same reason, are not very productive. They are wonderfully valuable for your cardiovascular health and building fitness, so I don't want to negate that. But just strictly speaking about osteoporosis, it's not as productive for bone health. Strength training, probably 2 or 3 times a week, building those muscles, applying that tension to your muscles and tendons on your bones, again, is what wakes up those osteoblasts. And examples could be lifting weights, but also something a little more gentle like Pilates. And then balance and flexibility. And I really want to highlight this, for instance, yoga and Tai Chi, because even fragile hips don't break without a fall. And so if you can prevent your risk of falling, then you are preventing your risk of fracture. And really focusing on improving and optimizing your balance can prevent all of the complications that might otherwise come with osteoporosis. So to finish, strongest risk factor for fracture is falling. It's not osteoporosis. Most or almost half of all hip fractures are attributed to impaired balance. And actually, we're finding that women have a higher fracture incidence, likely because they're more likely to fall over men. So it's not necessarily always because of impaired bone mineral density. And in thinking about this, really setting up your environment to be low risk, non-step slip mats, grab bars, lights, don't walk in a blizzard. Most of it is pretty common sense. So my top 10 steps, optimizing bone health, take control of your health because being passive is never productive. Eating a well-rounded plant-based diet we know has so many benefits for our overall health, preventing every disease and condition, including osteoporosis. Consider a daily dose of some of the foods and beverages that I listed on that sheet for you of calcium-containing sources. I would aim for 500, and you probably will get more than that. And that'll meet all of the needs probably. Discarding the calcium supplements and probably the milk. This doesn't mean don't use milk, but if you're using milk for the prevention of osteoporosis, then that's not a great tool for you, right? So as long as it's not intended to help your bones. Supplement with your vitamin D if you need to. Being active, because we know that focusing on cardio and strength and balance has a wonderful benefit for bone metabolism. Minimizing alcohol and tobacco use. When possible, minimizing the use of medications that affect your bone mineral density. Is there something that you can do that would offset the need for that medication so that you're not getting as much of it or you don't need to use it? Taking additional steps to decrease your risk of falls, and then always with every topic, aim to be an educated consumer, but don't stress. Thank you. Yeah. I am. I'm not talking about, great. Just flat, regular walking, which has a long history of being prescribed for osteoporosis prevention. So I was very disappointed about that. I started doing some light jogging for, even just myself, but this might be a tool for you as long as your back is okay with it, and you could start small and work out, make it more productive. Yeah. Any other questions? Yeah.
Earlier you mentioned the fat releases something that helps.
Estrogen. Yeah. Estrogen is really helpful because it not only makes osteoblasts more effective, like osteoblasts do a better job in the presence of estrogen, but estrogen also inhibits osteoclasts by killing them. They literally trigger apoptosis, which is a programmed cellular death of osteoclasts. So they help you out on both ends of the spectrum. Doesn't mean like gain weight so that you can protect your bones, but rather estrogen does an important job. So you have to consider that, right? If you are on a medication or postmenopausal. Yeah.
Obviously, the earlier you start this stuff, the better off you're going to be. But how happens when the damage is already done?
Yeah.
Can it be reversed?
You can.
Hold it on, what?
You can absolutely recover lost bone mass. If you follow those steps, you can improve your bone mineral density. Yeah, so focusing on diet and exercise in the way that you're able to, you can only recover, you can only do good, right? Yeah.
I have a dear friend that maybe she weighs 110 pounds. I don't know. She's had osteoporosis and has gone to the hospital and all that. She exercises 5 days a week on a treadmill. She has Parkinson's too, and she went from osteoporosis to osteopenia.
That's wonderful.
It has worked.
Yeah, that's wonderful. It's always good to hear stories about that. Any other questions? All right. Well, thank you very much for being here today, and I appreciate it. Thank you.